Forget every sugar-coated, glitter-dusted fantasy you've ever harbored about royal weddings. Erase the image of a radiant princess floating down the aisle toward her dashing prince, their eyes locking in a promise of eternal, fairy tale love. Banish the thought of a tender, private honeymoon on some sun-drenched, secluded island where they finally get to explore each other's souls and, other things. That entire narrative is a lie. A beautiful, profitable, meticulously crafted lie designed to make you feel warm and fuzzy about monarchical power structures. The truth, as it so often is, was far more moist, and not in a good way. The historical royal honeymoon wasn't a vacation. It was a high-stakes, publicly monitored, biological transaction. It was a pageant of shame, a theatrical performance of fertility, where the entire kingdom had a front-row seat, craning their necks to get a good look at the dynastic fluids. It was less about romance and more about proving the national plumbing was in working order. The blushing bride wasn't blushing from love. She was flushed with the terror of a high-stakes physical exam she was about to fail in front of a crowd. The groom wasn't beaming with pride. He was sweating under the weight of an entire nation's expectation, his performance anxiety capable of toppling alliances and sparking wars. We're not talking about love stories here. We're talking about two terrified strangers, often teenagers who didn't even speak the same language, being shoved into a bed while their relatives, priests, and government officials stood around with a checklist. Their first intimate moments were a spectator sport. Their bodies not their own, but assets of the state. Think of it as the world's most awkward, least sexy corporate merger, where the main clause in the contract required a public demonstration of product integration. Sound romantic? It wasn't. It was a grim, awkward, and often humiliating circus of lust, power, and political desperation, and we are going to crawl right into the heart of its filth. But before we bow to our historical overlords, I need to know who's in my little army of degenerates. Sound off in the comments. What patch of earth are you on, and what's the time on your sundial? Let me know who's ready to watch the powerful get filthy. All right, let's bend the knee for now. The journey to this state-sanctioned deflowering began not with a romantic proposal, but with a cold, hard negotiation that resembled a livestock auction more than a courtship. A princess was, first and foremost, a womb on legs, a vessel for a royal heir, and her value was calculated with brutal pragmatism. Her portrait would be passed around Europe's courts like a trading card, scrutinized by aging ministers who would debate the width of her hips, a supposed indicator of childbearing potential, and the purity of her lineage. The girl herself was an afterthought. Take the case of Anne of Cleves, poor woman, who became Henry VIII's fourth wife. Henry fell in love with a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein, a 16th-century version of a heavily filtered Instagram profile. He saw a demure, delicate beauty. He signed the contract. He committed the entire Kingdom of England to this union without ever having laid eyes on the actual physical woman. The preparation for the bride was a ritual of systematic erasure. Once the deal was sealed, she would embark on a long, arduous journey to her new, often hostile, home country. Upon arrival, she would be ceremonially stripped of everything that connected her to her past life. Her clothes were burned. Her ladies-in-waiting were sent packing. Her language, her customs, her very identity were to be shed like a dirty skin at the border. She was being remade, rebranded as property of her new master. Imagine being a teenager, plucked from your home, unable to speak the local tongue, surrounded by strangers who look at you with a mixture of suspicion and predatory interest. Your only job is to be pleasing to a man you've never met, and to get pregnant as quickly as possible. This was the welcome wagon. And then came the most intimate, degrading part of the pre-ritual, the inspection. This wasn't a gentle checkup. It was a forensic examination of the royal hymen, the fragile tissue that symbolized the integrity of the entire political alliance. A committee of grim-faced matrons, midwives, and sometimes even male physicians would be assembled. The young princess, trembling and exposed, would be laid out on a table or a bed, her legs held apart, while these strangers poked and prodded at her most private parts. They were searching for the seal of virginity, the unbroken proof that the merchandise was, in fact, factory new. The process was invasive, terrifying, and profoundly humiliating. It was a raw display of power, a message sent loud and clear: your body is not yours. It is a political instrument, and we have the right to inspect it, to verify its condition, to ensure it is fit for its purpose. The future of nations, the prevention of war, the continuation of a bloodline, it all rested on this thin, fragile membrane. Any ambiguity, any perceived imperfection could scuttle the entire marriage, bringing shame not just upon the girl, but upon her entire family and kingdom. For the groom, the preparation was different, but no less pressurized. While the bride's value was in her purity, the groom's was in his potency. His virility was a matter of national security. Physicians would consult him, offering unsolicited advice on diet and exercise to enhance his performance. They might prescribe truly bizarre concoctions, ground rhinoceros horn, sparrow brains, or the infamous cock ale, a brew made by boiling a rooster with spices and raisins. His sexual history, or lack thereof, would be a topic of whispered gossip among courtiers. Was he experienced? Too experienced? Was there any hint of unnatural inclinations? His performance on the wedding night was not a private matter between him and his new wife. It was a public demonstration of his fitness to rule. A failure to perform, to consummate the marriage, wasn't just personally embarrassing, it was a political crisis in the making, a sign of weakness that his enemies, both foreign and domestic, could exploit. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight of expectation that could render even the most confident man impotent. Just look at Louis XVI of France. He was a timid, awkward teenager, more interested in locksmithing than in the mechanics of royal reproduction. On his wedding night with the equally young Marie Antoinette, he was famously unable to perform. This wasn't just a personal failure, it became a national joke, a source of political instability that festered for 7 long years. The pre-ritual for both bride and groom was a psychological meat grinder designed to strip them of their individuality and remold them into their designated roles, the fertile vessel and the potent sire. It was a process steeped in anxiety, fear, and public shame, all before they even set foot in the bedchamber. The romance was already dead on arrival, strangled by the cold, grasping hands of dynastic ambition. They were not lovers preparing for a night of passion. They were sacrificial lambs being led to a very public, very awkward slaughter. The stage for this grim performance was the royal bedchamber, and you need to understand, this was no sanctuary of intimacy. It was a public theatre, an official government office where the most crucial state business was conducted. The room itself was designed to project power, not comfort. Imagine a vast, cavernous space with ceilings so high that your whispers would echo back at you, a constant reminder that you were never truly alone. The walls would be draped in heavy, oppressive tapestries depicting heroic battles or biblical scenes of righteous judgment, their woven eyes staring down at the couple with silent, eternal condemnation. The air would be thick and stagnant, a cocktail of competing stenches. You'd have the cloying sweetness of perfume, desperately trying and failing to mask the underlying funk of unwashed bodies, stale wine, and the faint, sour smell of human fear. In winter, the cavernous space would be hopelessly cold, the heat from a single massive fireplace failing to reach the far corners, leaving a damp chill that seeped into your bones. The light was always poor, supplied by flickering tallow candles or torches that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning familiar objects into monstrous shapes. It was a space designed for spectacle, not for two nervous people to fumble their way toward a connection. And at the center of this theater stood the main prop, the bed. This was no cozy nook for slumber. It was a monstrous piece of furniture, a four-posted fortress built to be seen. Carved from dark, heavy wood like oak or walnut, it would be a monument to the dynasty's wealth and, more importantly, its obsession with fertility. The posts might be thick as tree trunks, sculpted with aggressive symbols of virility, lions, unicorns, or even grotesquely detailed figures from mythology. The headboard would tower toward the ceiling, an altarpiece of procreation, perhaps depicting Adam and Eve or some other legendary fertile couple. This wasn't a bed, it was a throne lying on its back, a sacrificial altar upon which the future of the kingdom was to be conceived. The mattress itself would be a lumpy, unforgiving landscape, stuffed with straw, horsehair, or goose feathers that had long since compacted into dense, uncomfortable clumps. It offered little in the way of comfort. The linens, though perhaps made of fine linen or silk, would carry the faint, musty scent of previous occupants and the sweat of anxieties past. This was not a bed you sank into. It was a bed that held you captive, a raised platform for all to see. And see they would. The concept of privacy as we know it simply did not exist. The tools of the trade, beyond the bed itself, were crude and often dangerous. For the woman, preparation might involve a preemptive douche, a terrifying concoction of vinegar, alum, or even harsher chemicals like carbolic acid, intended to cleanse and tighten her for the ordeal ahead. These were not administered with medical precision. They were folk remedies that could cause burns, infections, and long-term damage. Her makeup, if she wore any, was a mask of lead-based foundation, a toxic layer of white that cracked and flaked, poisoning her slowly as she wore it. For the man, the tools were often alcoholic. A flagon of heavily spiced wine or strong ale would be placed by the bedside not for romantic lubrication, but as liquid courage, a way to numb the nerves and quell the performance anxiety. This often backfired, leading to sloppy, drunken fumbling or premature slumber, adding another layer of humiliation to the proceedings. The most horrifying tool, however, was the audience. Depending on the custom of the court, the level of observation varied from merely symbolic to horrifyingly literal. In some traditions, like the English Stuart court, the bedding ceremony was a full-blown public event. After the wedding feast, a procession of the highest-ranking nobles, ministers, and clergy would escort the couple to the bedchamber. They would watch as the bride and groom were ceremonially undressed by their attendants, a process filled with lewd jokes and raucous commentary. They would then be put into the bed curtains would be drawn, and a priest would bless the union, praying loudly for a fruitful outcome. The crowd would only then retreat, leaving the couple in a room thick with their lingering presence, their whispers and laughter still audible from the antechamber just outside the door. Imagine the pressure. You're naked, in a strange bed with a person you barely know, and the most powerful people in the kingdom are listening, waiting for the sounds that will confirm the marriage has been sealed. The environment itself was a weapon of control. Its grandeur was a constant reminder of the weight of duty. Its lack of privacy stripped the individuals of their agency. The symbolic carvings on the bed, the judgmental eyes on the tapestries, the lingering stench of other people, it all reinforced the central, brutal message of the night. This isn't about you. This isn't about love or desire or even pleasure. This is about the dynasty. Your bodies are merely the instruments, the flesh and blood tools required to forge the next link in the chain. The bedchamber wasn't a room. It was a crucible designed to burn away personal feelings and leave only the cold, hard product of a political necessity. In this suffocating theater of procreation, power was not an abstract concept. It was a palpable presence, a third person in the bed. The ultimate authority figure wasn't the groom, nor even the king who might be his father. The true power belonged to the disembodied, insatiable entity known simply as the state or the dynasty. This abstract monster, with its endless hunger for heirs and stability, was the silent director of the entire sordid play. Its human agents were everywhere, each wielding their own specific brand of control over the terrified couple. First and foremost was the reigning monarch, often the groom's father or the bride's new father-in-law. His interest was cold, clinical, and entirely political. He saw the couple not as his children, but as strategic assets. The consummation of their marriage was the final seal on a treaty, the guarantee of an alliance, the down payment on a future free from war. His approval was paramount, and his disappointment was terrifying. A king's displeasure could mean political ruin for the groom or a life of miserable isolation for the bride. He was the CEO overseeing this critical merger, and he expected a swift and successful completion. He wasn't interested in excuses, only results, and the result he wanted was a confirmed pregnancy. Then you had the Queen Mother or the Dowager Queen, a figure who often wielded a more intimate and therefore more insidious form of power. She had been through this meat grinder herself. She understood the grim mechanics of it all. But this shared experience rarely translated into sympathy. More often, it manifested as a rigid, unforgiving enforcement of tradition. She was the guardian of the dynasty's feminine mysteries, the high priestess of the royal womb. She would be the one leading the hymenal inspection, her eyes missing nothing. She would be the one interrogating the bride about her monthly cycles, her every bodily function becoming a matter of courtly discussion. Her power was rooted in her own survival, in her successful navigation of this very system. For the new princess, the Queen Mother could be a powerful ally or a formidable enemy, a gatekeeper whose favor could mean the difference between a life of relative comfort and one of perpetual misery. Her hypocrisy was often staggering. A woman who may have taken love as herself would enforce the strictest standards of purity on her daughter-in-law, not out of moral conviction, but to protect the legitimacy of the bloodline. It wasn't about fidelity, it was about quality control. Any child born from the royal womb had to be, without a shadow of a doubt, of the king's seed. Beyond the immediate family, there was the clergy. The church was deeply enmeshed in the politics of the royal bed. The consummation of a marriage was a sacrament, a holy act, but it was also a legal requirement. A marriage that was not consummated could be annulled, a fact that gave the church immense power. A priest would be on hand to bless the bed, to pray for fertility, and to offer spiritual counsel that was often just political pressure, wrapped in pious language. They would remind the couple of their sacred duty to be fruitful and multiply, framing the awkward, forced encounter as God's will. This religious framing was a powerful tool of psychological control, layering divine command on top of political necessity. It made any failure to perform not just a political crisis, but a spiritual failing, a sin against God himself. This authority was wielded with a chilling detachment. The case of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves is a masterclass in this dynamic. When Henry, disgusted by the reality of the woman he had married based on a painting, failed to consummate the marriage, the full machinery of state power swung into action. It wasn't treated as a private matter of sexual incompatibility. It was a crisis of state. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the man who arranged the match, found his own head on the chopping block. Anne was subjected to humiliating interrogations by the king's counsellors, forced to give graphic, clinical testimony about the non-events of her wedding nights. She had to describe in excruciating detail how the king would come to her bed, kiss her, and then fall asleep. Henry, for his part, had to testify before a council of physicians and bishops, claiming he was struck with a mysterious impotence, but only with her. He assured them his princely courage was perfectly functional with other women. The entire affair was a legal and political spectacle, with the intimate details of their sexual failure laid bare for the powerful to dissect. The power dynamic was clear: their bodies were public property. The authority figures, the king, his ministers, the church, viewed the couple as instruments. Their feelings, their comfort, their dignity, these were all secondary to the primary objective, the production of a legitimate heir. The power wasn't just in the room, it was in the legal codes, the religious doctrines, and the unwritten rules of courtly survival. It was a panopticon of control, ensuring that even in their most supposedly intimate moments, the royal couple was never, ever alone and never, ever free. The true ruler was the tyranny of expectation. To survive this psychological onslaught, the individuals at the center of this drama had to construct an internal world, a fortress of belief and justification to make sense of the madness. This wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a spiritual and mental one, and their minds scrabbled for frameworks to process the bizarre reality they were forced to inhabit. Their justifications were a cocktail of genuine faith, deep-seated superstition, and desperate self-preservation. Religion, of course, was the great and powerful opiate. For a young, terrified princess, the idea that her suffering was God's will could be a source of profound, if grim, comfort. She wasn't just being sold off like cattle, she was fulfilling a sacred duty, sacrificing her personal happiness for the good of Christendom, for the stability of two great nations. Priests would have drilled this into her head from a young age. Every prayer, every mass was a reinforcement of this narrative. The act of sex itself, stripped of all romance or pleasure, could be reframed as a holy obligation, a necessary step in the divine plan to create a future king who would be a defender of the faith. This belief system could turn terror into pious resignation. It gave a higher meaning to the shame and the pain, transforming a political transaction into a personal martyrdom. The groom, too, could lean on this. His divine right to rule was not just a political theory, it was a deeply felt belief. God had chosen him, his family, his bloodline, to lead. Therefore, his duty to procreate was a holy one. Any personal distaste for his new bride was an earthly trifle to be overcome in the service of a divine mandate. The act of consummation wasn't about desire, it was about ensuring the continuation of God's chosen lineage on earth. This wasn't just a justification, it was a core part of his identity. But where organized religion provided the grand narrative, folk medicine and raw superstition governed the terrifying details. The science of reproduction was a black box of terrifying guesswork. People genuinely believed in things that seem utterly insane to us now. It was thought, for instance, that a child's characteristics could be determined by the mother's thoughts at the moment of conception. A frightened or disgusted thought could lead to a deformed or weak child. This put an incredible pressure on the princess to not only submit physically, but to control her thoughts, to somehow conjure feelings of dutiful affection lest she birth a monster. They believed in maternal impressions, the idea that if a pregnant woman saw something shocking, like a cripple or a fire, the image could be imprinted onto her unborn child. The world was a minefield of potential deformities. To ward off these evils, they relied on a whole arsenal of superstitious junk. Amulets made of toadstone or wolf's teeth might be sewn into the bedding. The bride might be made to drink a concoction of herbs and powdered gems to increase her fertility. The timing of the encounter would be meticulously planned according to astrological charts, avoiding unlucky conjunctions of planets that might doom the resulting child. The air was thick with unseen forces, with potential curses and blessings that had to be carefully managed. This created a psychological landscape of constant, low-grade terror. A failed consummation wasn't just a political failure, it could be a sign of a curse, of witchcraft, or of divine displeasure. A miscarriage wasn't a biological event, it was a punishment for some unknown sin. Catherine the Great's experience with her husband, the future Tsar Peter III, is a perfect example of this collision of belief systems. Their marriage was a disaster from day one. Peter was infantile, cruel, and likely impotent, For years there was no heir. The court was rife with speculation. Was it her fault? Was it his? Was the new German princess barren, a bad omen for Russia? Catherine, in her memoirs, describes her internal state with chilling clarity. She saw the political necessity, she understood her duty, but she was trapped with a man she despised. Her psychological justification became one of pure, cold ambition. If she could not find love or even basic companionship, she would find power. Her internal monologue shifted from that of a wife to that of a future ruler. She began to see the production of an heir not as a wifely duty, but as a strategic move, a necessary step to secure her own position in this hostile court. When she finally did give birth to a son, Paul, it was widely rumored, and she did little to dispel these rumors, that his father was not Peter, but her lover, Sergei Saltykov. In her mind, the justification was simple. The dynasty needed an heir, and if her pathetic husband couldn't provide one, she would procure one by other means. The sacred bloodline became a convenient fiction. Her internal justification had evolved from religious duty to ruthless pragmatism. This is the key to their survival, the ability to build a story inside their own heads that allowed them to endure the unendurable. Whether it was the story of the holy martyr, the cursed victim, or the pragmatic survivor, they had to believe in something. Without that internal narrative, the sheer crushing weight of the reality, the public humiliation, the political pressure, the physical discomfort would have been enough to drive them completely insane. The feast is over. The wine-sodden courtiers have made their last lewd joke. The procession, a shuffling, whispering mass of silk and velvet, has guided the two strangers to the threshold of the bedchamber. The priest has mumbled his final, hollow blessing. The heavy door closes, but the silence it leaves behind is not peaceful. It's a loud, ringing silence, thick with expectation. This is it, the first point of contact, and it is almost never the tender, passionate union of fantasy. It is a shock, a clumsy, awkward collision of two terrified bodies, each burdened with a crippling weight of duty and fear. All the meticulous preparation, the political maneuvering, the psychological justifications, it all evaporates in this moment of raw, uncomfortable reality. Imagine you are the princess. You are perhaps 15 years old. You are in a strange bed, in a strange country, next to a man whose language you may not even speak. He might be a boy your own age, just as scared as you are. Or he could be a gnarled, aging monarch old enough to be your grandfather, his breath sour with wine. You've been told your entire life that this moment is your sole purpose, the culmination of your existence. But nobody told you what it would actually feel like. The fumbling in the near darkness, the unfamiliar weight of another person's body, the sheer, ungraceful mechanics of it all. It's not transcendent, it's bewildering. The case of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI is perhaps the most famous example of this initial shock leading to a long, grinding halt. She was 14, he was 15. Both were children, thrust into the heart of the most sophisticated and debauched court in Europe. On their wedding night, after the exhausting public rituals, they were finally left alone. And nothing happened. Louis was shy, physically awkward, and likely suffering from a medical condition called phimosis, which made arousal painful. Marie was a naive young girl with no sexual education whatsoever. The encounter was probably a mess of confused silence, timid advances, and ultimate, mortifying failure. The shock was not one of passion, but of anticlimax. The great, earth-shattering moment of consummation was a dud. This initial failure set the tone for the next 7 years of their marriage, a constant, humiliating reminder of their inadequacy. Now imagine you are the groom. The entire kingdom is metaphorically watching. Your princely courage, as Henry V so delicately put it, is on the line. Failure is not an option. This anxiety is a potent extinguisher of desire. George IV of Great Britain had a particularly disastrous first point of contact with his bride, Caroline of Brunswick. He was a man of huge appetites, a decadent, self-indulgent prince who was already secretly and illegally married to a Catholic widow whom he adored. But he was forced by his father and the government to marry his German cousin Caroline to secure his succession and pay off his massive debts. He was repulsed by her from the moment they met. He claimed she was unhygienic and uncouth. On their wedding night, he reportedly got so blind drunk that he passed out in the fireplace, spending his first night of marital bliss in a sooty, alcoholic stupor on the grate. The consummation, if it happened at all, was a grim, duty-bound affair the next day, fueled by resentment and disgust. The shock here was one of pure, mutual revulsion. This wasn't a meeting of souls, it was a collision of resentments, the forced union of two people who despised each other on sight. The initial contact was often a moment of profound disillusionment. The portrait that looked so lovely turned out to be a plain, pockmarked woman. The mighty warrior king of reputation turned out to be a paunchy, sweating old man. This was the reality for Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. After seeing her in the flesh, Henry's fantasy shattered. He famously complained to his ministers, "She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported." He found her coarse, unattractive, and lacking the courtly graces he expected. He went to her bed, as he later testified, but was so overcome with distaste that he could not find it in his heart to proceed. He left her, he claimed, as much of a maid as he found her. For Anne, the shock must have been equally profound. She had travelled all this way to marry a great king, only to be met with coldness and disgust. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, her body the subject of a king's very public, very insulting rejection. The first point of contact, then, was the moment the cold, hard reality of the arrangement crashed head-on into whatever personal hopes or fears the individuals carried. It was rarely gentle. It was often clumsy, sometimes brutal, and frequently a complete and utter failure. Any illusion of romance, any sliver of hope for a genuine connection was often extinguished in these first few awkward, miserable moments. The shock wasn't one of erotic discovery, it was the shock of realizing that their bodies were just pieces of meat in a political butcher shop, and the knife was about to fall. The grand myth of a royal union was instantly reduced to its bleak, mechanical, and deeply human core, a moment of fumbling, fear, and profound, echoing disappointment. If the first contact was a shock, what followed was the grinding chaos, the slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of normal, where public duty choked out any hope of private intimacy. This wasn't a single event, but a sustained, relentless slog. The honeymoon period, if you can even call it that, was a blur of repeated, joyless attempts, constant monitoring, and the soul-crushing weight of perpetual observation. The marriage bed, that grand theatrical stage, became a place of work, a grim, repetitive, and often fruitless labor. For Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, this midpoint slog lasted for 7 excruciating years. 7 years of the entire court of Versailles whispering, gossiping, and writing salacious pamphlets about the king's impotence and the queen's barrenness. Imagine that every single night you are expected to perform a task you find difficult or painful, with a partner you may not desire, all while knowing that your failure is the talk of the town. Courtiers would scrutinize their every interaction. Did they look at each other? Did he touch her hand? Did she seem pale this morning? The Queen's own mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, sent a relentless stream of letters berating her daughter, demanding to know why she wasn't pregnant yet, offering crude and unhelpful advice. She even sent spies to report back on the intimate details of their non-existent sex life. The pressure was a physical presence, a poison that seeped into every aspect of their lives. The chaos was not just psychological, it was deeply, graphically physical. Let's dive into the anatomical comedy of it all. In an age without modern medical knowledge, the proposed cures for infertility or impotence were a grotesque carnival of quackery. Royal physicians whose careers depended on a successful royal birth would be called in. These men, armed with a terrifying blend of arrogance and ignorance, would subject the royal couple to a battery of humiliating treatments. The king might be subjected to leeching, the theory being that his humours were out of balance. He might be prescribed diets of raw eggs and oysters, or more esoteric fare like powdered stag beetle. For Louis XVI, the solution was eventually identified as phimosis, a condition easily corrected today with a minor surgical procedure. But in the 18th century, surgery was a terrifying, unhygienic butcher's work. The prospect of a knife near the royal genitals was a matter of grave state security. The debate over whether to perform the surgery raged for years, a testament to how the king's body was not his own, but a subject of national debate. For the Queen, the treatments were equally invasive. She would be bled, purged, and made to drink foul-tasting herbal tonics. Her womb, the most politicized organ in the kingdom, would be subjected to bizarre and useless interventions. Physicians might prescribe steam baths for her nether regions, or the insertion of pessaries made from wool soaked in bizarre concoctions. The entire process was a sustained, intimate violation, a constant reminder that her body was a malfunctioning piece of state machinery that needed to be fixed, no matter the cost to her dignity. This grinding chaos also played out in the daily routine. The couple would be forced to maintain the public fiction of a happy marriage. They would dine together, attend mass together, and play cards together, all under the watchful eyes of the court. Their every word and gesture would be interpreted for signs of affection or discord. But behind closed doors, the reality was often one of grim silence or bitter resentment. They were two prisoners locked in the same gilded cage, their shared failure a constant, unspoken accusation between them. The case of Catherine the Great and Peter III illustrates a different kind of midpoint slog. Theirs wasn't a problem of non-consummation due to shyness, but due to mutual loathing and Peter's bizarre behavior. He was a man-child who preferred to play with toy soldiers, often drilling his servants for hours on end, than to perform his husbandly duties. Catherine, in her memoirs, writes about the sheer, soul-destroying boredom and disgust of their life together. The grinding chaos for her was not the pressure to have sex, but the daily struggle of cohabiting with a man she considered a dangerous imbecile. She describes nights where he would bring his mistress to her apartments, or force her to participate in his mock military games. Her survival depended on a strategy of silent observation and political maneuvering. She used this long, fallow period not to pine for a husband's affection, but to learn the Russian language, to read voraciously, and to cultivate allies within the court. The slog for her became a period of intense, covert self-education and power-building. The sustained horror of this period cannot be overstated. It was a time when hope died a slow death, replaced by a grim, pragmatic routine. The body became a source of shame and frustration. The partner became either an accomplice in misery or an object of contempt. The initial shock of the wedding night gave way to a chronic condition of despair, a long, dark tunnel with no end in sight. The pressure to produce an heir, the whispers of the court, the invasive procedures of the physicians, it all combined into a relentless, soul-crushing assault that could last for years, hollowing out the individuals until all that was left was the public shell of their royal roles. In a system built on the absolute necessity of a successful biological outcome, failure was not just a possibility, it was a catastrophic public downfall. When the dynastic machine sputtered and broke, the fallout was swift, brutal, and profoundly humiliating. The inevitable downfall wasn't a dramatic battle, it was often an anticlimactic slide into shame, accusation, and political ruin, a pathetic fizzle rather than an explosive bang. This is where any lingering shred of royal dignity was stripped away and burned for all to see. The most common form of downfall was the public acknowledgement of impotence or infertility, which immediately weaponized the couple against each other. It was never a shared problem. It was always someone's fault. The man's failure to perform was a direct challenge to his masculinity and his right to rule. It was a sign of weakness, a crack in the facade of divine authority that his enemies could pry open. The woman's failure to conceive was a sign of her worthlessness, a breach of her one and only contractual obligation. She was a barren field, a defective vessel, and could be discarded as such. Henry VIII was the undisputed master of turning this downfall into a political tool. His entire reign was a bloody carousel of matrimonial failure and disposal. With Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, the downfall was a slow, agonizing burn. She bore him several children, but only one, a daughter, Mary, survived infancy. After 2 decades of marriage, Henry, desperate for a male heir and infatuated with Anne Boleyn, declared their union cursed by God. The downfall was a theological and legal masterpiece of self-justification. He argued that because Catherine had been his brother's wife, their marriage was incestuous in the eyes of God, and thus God was withholding a son. This narrative transformed his political desperation into a crisis of conscience. Catherine was demoted, her daughter declared a bastard, and she was cast aside to live out her days in lonely isolation. The failure was laid squarely at her feet, a divine punishment for a sin she was forced to embody. With Anne of Cleves, the downfall was more of a farce. Henry's immediate and vocal revulsion led to a swift annulment. The official grounds were flimsy, a supposed pre-contract she had with another man, and, most humiliatingly, the non-consummation. The King of England had to publicly, legally declare that he could not bring himself to have sex with his wife. The court records preserve the cringe-inducing testimony. His physicians were called to examine him and attest to his general virility, while courtiers testified to the king's nightly complaints. The downfall of the marriage was a bureaucratic procedure, a clinical dissection of sexual failure. Anne, to her credit, navigated this humiliation with remarkable savvy, agreeing to the annulment and accepting the title of King's beloved sister, which allowed her to live out her life in comfort in England. She dodged the axe that fell on so many of his other wives, but the public shame was an indelible part of the deal. The downfall could also be triggered by disgust, as with George IV and Caroline of Brunswick. After their single, reluctant consummation, produced a daughter, Princess Charlotte. They lived apart, their mutual hatred a public scandal. When George ascended to the throne as king, his first order of business was to try and divorce Caroline and prevent her from being crowned queen. This led to the trial of Queen Caroline in 1821, a sensational public spectacle where the government, at the king's behest, accused her of adultery. Her life was raked over the coals, with servants and spies paid to testify about her licentious behavior during her years of exile in Italy. The downfall became a sordid, farcical soap opera, with the public largely taking Caroline's side against the deeply unpopular king. She was ultimately acquitted, but the king barred her from his coronation. She hammered on the doors of Westminster Abbey, demanding to be let in, a pathetic and public display of her ultimate humiliation. She died a few weeks later, a broken woman. In these scenarios, the undignified end is the point. There is no tragic grandeur. There is only the pathetic spectacle of powerful people being undone by the most basic human frailties. Louis XVI's long-delayed consummation was eventually cured, but the 7-year delay had already done irreparable damage to the monarchy's prestige. The endless stream of pornographic pamphlets mocking his impotence had eroded the mystique of divine right. The failure of his body became a symbol for the failure of the entire regime. His downfall wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it was a contributing factor to the French Revolution, a crack in the foundations of the old world. The system was designed for success, with no elegant off-ramp for failure. When things went wrong, they didn't just go wrong, they shattered in the most public, most shameful way possible. The downfall was a process of ritualized degradation, where the sacred bodies of the royals were exposed as flawed, dysfunctional, and ultimately miserably human. Any pretense of power or control was lost in a pathetic heap of medical excuses, legal accusations, and public ridicule. The end was never noble, it was just an awkward, messy, and deeply humiliating anticlimax. In this oppressive system where bodies were state property and failure meant ruin, it's tempting to see the royal couple as pure victims, helpless puppets in a dynastic horror show. And while they were certainly trapped, human nature is rarely that simple. Even in the most restrictive cages, the desire for agency, for a shred of control, flickers to life. These moments of resistance and failed escapes are crucial because they break the monotonous narrative of oppression. They are often small, futile, and pathetic acts of defiance, but they are profoundly human. They remind us that these were not just symbols, they were people choking on their gilded chains and occasionally, desperately, trying to bite the hand that fed them. Subtle defiance was the most common and often the most effective form of resistance. For a queen trapped in a loveless, monitored marriage, taking a lover was not just an act of passion, it was a radical act of self-possession. It was a way of reclaiming her own body, of creating a private space of pleasure and intimacy in a life that afforded none. Catherine the Great became the master of this. After producing the required heir, likely not her husband's, she embarked on a series of affairs with powerful, intelligent men like Grigory Orlov and Grigory Potemkin. These were not just romantic dalliances, they were strategic alliances. She used her lovers to build a power base, to gather information, and ultimately to overthrow her useless husband and seize the throne for herself. Her sexuality became her greatest political weapon, a tool of resistance that she wielded with breathtaking skill. For a less powerful woman, the resistance was smaller, more personal. It could be a shared, cynical joke with a trusted lady-in-waiting, a moment of black humor at the expense of her pompous husband. It could be feigning illness to avoid another joyless night in the marital bed. For Anne of Cleves, her act of resistance was her cheerful compliance. Instead of fighting the annulment and facing a grim fate, she astutely recognized the escape route she was being offered. By agreeing to be the king's sister, she defied the expected script of the hysterical, discarded wife. She secured for herself a life of wealth, freedom, and independence that was denied to almost all women of her time, a far better fate than being queen to a monster like Henry. It was a brilliant piece of emotional jiu-jitsu, turning a public humiliation into a personal victory. Failed escapes are, of course, a more tragic form of this resistance. The story of a princess trying to flee her marriage and return home is a recurring motif, though one that almost always ends in failure. Once the political contract was signed and the dowry paid, she was property. An escape would be a diplomatic incident, an act of theft against the crown. She would be hunted down, dragged back, and likely punished with even stricter confinement. Her failed escape would only serve to tighten the bars of her cage, a brutal lesson in the futility of hope. There were also moments of what you might call a customer's revolt, where the groom himself would resist the transaction. The most dramatic example is George IV's reaction to Caroline of Brunswick. His resistance wasn't subtle, it was loud, drunken, and continuous. From the moment he met her, he tried to wriggle out of the marriage. He begged his father, he complained to his ministers, he made his disgust publicly known. His passing out in the fireplace on his wedding night can be seen as an act of passive-aggressive defiance, a refusal to play his part in the charade. His decades-long campaign to divorce her was a sustained, if deeply unlikable, act of resistance against the political machine that had forced them together. He was a spoiled, selfish man, but his rebellion, pathetic as it was, highlighted the inherent inhumanity of the system. Even in the most controlled environments, emotional cracks would appear. The mask of royal detachment would slip, revealing the raw, ugly emotions beneath. A queen, after years of silent endurance, might erupt in a furious tirade against her husband or a rival courtier. A king, frustrated by his own impotence, might lash out with cruelty or sink into a deep depression. These were the moments the system feared most, the moments when the human element threatened to derail the political machinery. These acts of resistance, successful or not, are the flashes of humanity in the darkness. They show that these individuals were not just cogs in a machine. They were thinking, feeling people who resented their roles, who yearned for freedom, and who, in their own small or grand ways, pushed back against the crushing weight of their destiny. Most of these attempts failed, of course. The system was too powerful, the stakes too high. But in the trying, they asserted their existence, reminding us that even a pawn on a chessboard can dream of being a queen, or at least of knocking the whole damn board over. The tragedy is not just that they were trapped, but that they knew they were trapped, and their failed struggles for freedom only made the reality of their imprisonment more bitter. Just when you think the situation can't get any more humiliating or bizarre, history has a delightful habit of introducing a wildcard element, an escalation that throws gasoline on the already smouldering dumpster fire of the royal marriage. This is the point where the narrative veers from tragicomedy into the realm of the truly grotesque and surreal. The wildcard could be a person, an event, or a new, terrible idea that complicates everything and pushes the protagonists to their absolute limits. Often this escalation came in the form of a so-called expert, the royal physician with a new, revolutionary, and invariably horrifying cure. When Louis XVII and Marie Antoinette's marriage remained unconsummated for years, the wild card arrived in the form of a diplomatic intervention. Marie's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, travelled to Versailles with the explicit mission of fixing his brother-in-law's plumbing. He wasn't a doctor, but he played one on the world stage. He sat the timid French king down for a man-to-man chat, a brutally frank discussion about the mechanics of sex. According to Joseph's own letters, he found Louis to be a well-built man, but one who was apathetic and sluggish in the bedroom, a weakling. He gave the king what amounted to a remedial sex ed class, advising him on technique and urging him to simply complete the act. Imagine the sheer, mortifying absurdity of it all. The King of France, the absolute monarch of the most powerful nation in Europe, being lectured on how to get an erection by his Austrian brother-in-law. This intervention, combined with the eventual minor surgery Louis underwent, finally did the trick. But the escalation, the direct involvement of a foreign ruler in the king's sex life, was a new level of international humiliation. Another common wildcard was the sudden intrusion of a political crisis that made the production of an heir not just desirable, but existentially urgent. Imagine a king is childless, and his closest male relative and heir is a hated rival from a competing branch of the family. Suddenly the pressure in the royal bedchamber is ratcheted up to an unbearable degree. Every failed attempt to conceive a child brings the kingdom one step closer to a potential civil war upon the king's death. This was the situation for many monarchs. The abstract duty to the dynasty becomes a frantic race against time. The joyless mechanical act of sex is now freighted with the immediate fate of the nation. The wild card could also be a sudden, virulent outbreak of rumor and superstition. Let's say a queen has a series of miscarriages. The court, a hotbed of paranoia and intrigue, doesn't see a medical issue. They see witchcraft. A rival faction at court seeking to discredit the queen and her family might subtly plant rumors that she is cursed, or worse, that she is a witch herself, deliberately sabotaging the succession. A search for a scapegoat begins. A lady-in-waiting might be accused, tortured, and forced to confess to placing a hex on the royal womb. The personal tragedy of losing a child escalates into a full-blown witch hunt, a vortex of paranoia and political violence that could easily consume the queen herself. The arrival of a charismatic and ambitious mistress could also be a classic wild card. She wasn't just a romantic rival, she was a political player. If she was clever, she could use her influence over the king to devastating effect. If the queen was barren, the mistress might conveniently become pregnant, proving the king's virility and, by extension, the queen's defectiveness. The mistress's child, though illegitimate, could become a political pawn, a potential claimant to the throne that destabilized the official line of succession. Madame de Montespan, the powerful mistress of Louis XIV, wielded enormous influence. Her children, with the king legitimized and given high titles, a constant, living rebuke to the official queen, Maria Theresa of Spain. Perhaps the most bizarre wildcard was the introduction of new, scientific theories about conception that were pure fantasy. In the 17th century, the theory of preformationism became popular. It was the belief that every future human being existed in miniature, fully formed, inside either the egg, ovism, or the sperm, spermism. The act of conception was merely the catalyst for this tiny homunculus to begin growing. This led to absurd debates. If all humanity was contained in Eve's ovaries, was every sexual act that didn't result in a child a form of murder? This added a new layer of metaphysical dread to an already stressful situation. These wildcard elements served to tighten the screws. They took a situation that was already a grinding, miserable slog and turned it into a crisis. The physician with his terrifying tools, the foreign relative with his unsolicited advice, the political rival with his poisonous rumors, they all served to strip away the last vestiges of privacy and control from the royal couple. The problem was no longer just their problem. It was now a public spectacle, a matter for doctors, diplomats, and demagogues. The escalation ensured that there was no escape, no corner of their lives left untouched by the relentless, grotesque demands of the dynasty. The main event, whether it was a fumbled failure or a grimly successful duty, is over. The courtiers have finally shuffled away, their whispers fading down the cold stone corridors. The sun, indifferent to the microscopic dramas of humanity, begins to rise. What's left is the aftermath, the quiet, hollowed-out landscape of the morning after. This is not a scene of tender cuddling or post-coital bliss. It's a sterile, grotesque tableau of triage, cleanup, and evidence collection. The tone is exhausted, the air thick with the smell of stale sweat and regret. The first order of business was the inspection of the evidence. In many courts, the most crucial part of the consummation ritual happened the next day. A delegation of high-ranking officials, sober, grim-faced ministers and senior ladies of the court, would solemnly enter the bedchamber to perform the inspection of the sheets. This was the moment of truth. They were looking for the proof, the bloodstains that would validate the bride's virginity and confirm that the dynastic transfer was complete. Imagine the scene. The young couple, exhausted and humiliated, forced to lie in or stand beside the bed while these old men and women lift the linens, holding them up to the morning light, scrutinizing them for the requisite smears of red. It's a moment of profound, clinical violation. The bride's most intimate biological process is transformed into a piece of state evidence, passed around and commented upon like a legal document. The conversation would be hushed, technical. Is the quantity sufficient? Is the color correct? It was a forensic analysis of a deflowering. If the evidence was deemed satisfactory, a wave of relief would pass through the court. Official announcements would be drafted, and couriers would be dispatched to every friendly capital in Europe, carrying the good news: the marriage is consummated, the alliance is secure. If the sheets were clean, however, a quiet panic would set in. Was the bride not a virgin? Was the groom impotent? The blame game would begin immediately in hushed, urgent whispers. The aftermath was also a scene of quiet, personal horror. For the young princess, this was often her first sexual experience, and it was framed entirely by pain, duty, and public scrutiny. There was no concept of aftercare, no comfort, no reassurance. She was expected to simply endure it. The cleanup was a task for her ladies-in-waiting, who would quietly dispose of the soiled linens and help her wash. Their faces would be a mask of professional detachment, but their silence would be heavy with unspoken pity or judgment. She was now officially a wife. Her value had been transferred from potential to reality. Her body had done its job. Now began the next phase of anxious waiting, the countdown to her first missed period. For the groom, the aftermath could be a moment of grim satisfaction, relief, or deepening shame. If he had succeeded, he had affirmed his manhood and secured his political standing. He could walk through the court with a new swagger, accepting the knowing smirks and congratulatory nods of his fellow nobles. But if he had failed, the morning after was a walk of shame. He would have to face his father, his ministers, and the entire court, knowing that they all knew he had been unequal to the task. His failure would hang in the air, a stink of inadequacy that would follow him everywhere. The physical landscape of the aftermath was one of quiet grotesquerie. A rumpled bed that looked less like a scene of passion and more like a minor skirmish had taken place. A flagon of wine, half empty, the smell of snuffed-out candles, perhaps the faint, metallic scent of blood. It was a sterile, joyless scene. The contrast with the previous night's feasting and finery was stark. All the pomp and ceremony had been stripped away, leaving only this, the biological residue of a political contract. In the case of a truly disastrous encounter like that of George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, the aftermath was one of immediate, bitter separation. There was no pretense of a shared mourning. They retreated to their separate wings of the palace as quickly as possible, their mutual disgust solidifying into a lifelong enmity. The looting in this context was political. Factions at court would immediately begin to assess the situation. Who had gained power? Who had lost it? The successful consummation of a marriage could elevate the bride's family and their allies. A failed one could be the first step in the political ruin of those who arranged the match, like Thomas Cromwell after the Anne of Cleves debacle. The aftermath was not an end, it was a beginning. It was the moment the private, physical event was fully absorbed into the public political bloodstream. The quiet, exhausted silence of the bedchamber was just the calm before the storm of gossip, speculation, and political maneuvering that would dominate the court for weeks, months, or even years to come. The bodies had been used, the evidence collected, and the stage was now set for the next act in the long, grinding drama of dynastic survival. The physical ordeal may be over, but the psychological wounds have just begun to fester. The trauma of the royal wedding night and its aftermath didn't just fade with the morning sun. It embedded itself deep in the psyches of the individuals, shaping their relationships, their personalities, and their political destinies. The scars were often invisible, but they were profound, leading to a lifetime of coping mechanisms that ranged from emotional numbness and dark humor to outright cruelty and pathological behavior. For many royal brides, the experience solidified a sense of profound alienation. Plucked from her home, stripped of her identity, and subjected to a humiliating and often painful sexual initiation, she learned a brutal lesson early on. She was utterly alone. Her body was a tool, her feelings were irrelevant, and her survival depended on her ability to suppress her own humanity. This often led to a state of emotional numbness, a protective shell built to withstand the constant scrutiny and lack of genuine affection. She would learn to play the part of the dutiful wife and queen, her face a serene mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. This was the path of quiet survival chosen by countless queens throughout history. They found solace in religion, in charity work, or in the meticulous management of their households, anything to distract from the emotional void at the center of their lives. Their relationship with their husbands was rarely one of partnership. It was a professional arrangement, often characterized by a cool, respectful distance. They were co-workers in the business of dynasty, not lovers. Any children born of the union were not sources of maternal joy, but strategic assets, future pawns in the same brutal game they were forced to play. This emotional detachment was a necessary survival tool, but it came at a terrible cost, creating a legacy of cold, formal family dynamics that echoed down through generations. For others, the trauma manifested as a desperate search for the intimacy and control they were denied. This is where the figure of the queen who takes a lover becomes so significant. An affair was not just a quest for pleasure, it was an act of psychological rebellion. It was a way to experience a relationship where she was chosen for herself, not for her womb or her title. It was a space where she could, for a few stolen hours, feel like a person rather than a political symbol. The risk was enormous. Discovery meant disgrace, repudiation, and even death. But for some, the psychological need was so great that it outweighed the danger. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was a tragic example. A young, vivacious girl thrust into a marriage with an aging, obese, and tyrannical king, she sought affection in the arms of a handsome courtier, Thomas Culpeper. Her affair was a reckless, desperate attempt to find a sliver of happiness in a miserable existence. When it was discovered, the king's wounded pride and paranoia knew no bounds. She was executed for treason, her search for love reframed as a heinous crime against the state. The trauma for the men was different, but no less damaging. A king who failed to perform on his wedding night like Louis XVI could carry that shame for years. It could feed a sense of inadequacy that permeated his entire reign, making him hesitant and indecisive. For a man raised to believe in his own God-given authority, public impotence was the ultimate humiliation. His coping mechanism was to retreat into his hobbies, his locks and his hunting, areas where he could exercise a sense of mastery and control that was denied to him in the bedchamber. Conversely, a king who viewed the consummation as a distasteful but necessary duty might cope by compartmentalizing his life. The queen was for heirs, mistresses were for pleasure and companionship. This was the standard model for centuries. The king would perform his dynastic duty with his wife, then retreat to the apartments of his mistress, where he could find a facsimile of a normal relationship. This created a court culture rife with hypocrisy, where the queen was publicly honored and privately ignored, forced to endure the daily humiliation of her husband's very public infidelities. The psychological scars often turned inward, manifesting as bitterness and cruelty. A king who felt trapped in a hateful marriage like George IV could become a tyrant in his own home, making his wife's life a living hell. A queen who felt scorned and powerless could become a master of political intrigue, using her position to undermine her rivals and exact revenge on those who had wronged her. The court became a snake pit of festering resentments, the lingering trauma of the royal marriage poisoning the entire political atmosphere. Dark humor was another essential coping mechanism. The sheer absurdity of their situation was not lost on them. In private letters and diaries, you can often find a cynical, world-weary wit. It was a way of maintaining sanity, of looking the grotesque reality of their lives straight in the eye and laughing at it. This cynical detachment was perhaps the most honest response to a system that demanded so much and gave so little in return. The ultimate psychological scar was the perpetuation of the cycle. A prince who grew up in a cold, loveless household, who witnessed his parents' dysfunctional marriage, was likely to repeat the same pattern. A princess raised to be a political pawn would raise her own daughters for the same fate. The trauma was generational, a poison passed down through the royal bloodline, ensuring that each new generation would be subjected to the same psychological meat grinder. The gilded cage was, in effect, a haunted house, each room echoing with the quiet misery of those who had come before. The personal traumas of the royal bedchamber did not remain confined within the palace walls. Like a stone dropped in a pond, the consequences of a successful or failed royal union rippled outward, profoundly affecting the entire society. The obsession with the royal womb was not just a courtly pastime, it was a matter of public obsession and national security, with tangible impacts on public health, the economy, and the law. A failed consummation or a barren queen could, and often did, lead directly to war. The War of the Spanish Succession, which embroiled Europe in over a decade of bloody conflict at the beginning of the 18th century, was triggered by the death of the childless King Charles II of Spain. His lifelong health problems, including his impotence, were a subject of European diplomatic concern for decades. When he finally died without a direct heir, the competing claims of the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs to the Spanish throne plunged the continent into a devastating war. The fate of millions rested on the reproductive failure of one man. The public health crises that emanated from the often debauched lifestyles of the royals were also significant. Syphilis, the great pox, ravaged the noble houses of Europe. While a king might be expected to be faithful to his dynastic marriage for the purpose of legitimate heirs, his affairs were often numerous. This created a vector for disease that flowed from the king to his mistress, from the mistress to her other lovers, and so on, creating a web of infection. The cures were often as deadly as the disease. Mercury was a common treatment, a potent neurotoxin that caused tremors, tooth loss, and madness. The sight of a noble with a collapsed nose or slurred speech, a telltale sign of late-stage syphilis or mercury poisoning, was a common one. The very bloodline they were so desperate to preserve was often being poisoned by their own behavior. The economic impact was staggering. A royal wedding was not just a ceremony, it was an economic stimulus package. The immense sums spent on a queen's dowry, on the wedding festivities, on the creation of a new royal household, this money flowed into the pockets of merchants, artisans, and bankers. A successful marriage that produced an heir ensured stability, which was good for trade and commerce. Conversely, the instability caused by a succession crisis could wreck an economy, disrupt trade routes, and lead to crippling taxes to fund the inevitable wars. The entire system of aristocratic land ownership and inheritance was predicated on the orderly transfer of property through legitimate heirs. A single barren marriage at the top could throw the inheritance of thousands of lesser nobles into question, leading to endless, ruinous legal battles. This obsession with legitimacy and procreation also drove the creation and enforcement of laws. The legal distinction between a legitimate child and a bastard was absolute. A bastard could not inherit a title or property, a rule designed to protect the integrity of the bloodline. This had a profound effect on society as a whole, stigmatizing illegitimacy and creating a permanent underclass of people with no legal rights or social standing. The Church's power to grant or deny annulments based on non-consummation gave it immense legal and political leverage. Kings like Henry VIII would go to extreme lengths, even breaking with the Catholic Church entirely to get the legal ruling they needed to secure their succession. The law was not an impartial system of justice. It was a tool to be manipulated in the service of dynastic ambition. The fate of the next generation was perhaps the most tragic ripple effect. Children born from these strained political unions were often raised in emotionally sterile environments. They were cared for by nurses and governesses, seeing their royal parents only at scheduled times. They were not children so much as they were heirs in training, their lives mapped out for them from birth. The pressure to conform, to marry for political reasons, to continue the cycle, was immense. And what of the illegitimate children, the byproducts of the king's private life? They existed in a strange limbo. Some, like the children of Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan, were acknowledged and given wealth and titles, a constant thorn in the side of the legitimate family. Others were quietly pensioned off, hidden away in remote convents or monasteries. They were the living, breathing evidence of the hypocrisy at the heart of the system, a constant reminder that the sacred bloodline was often a convenient fiction. The societal ripple effect was a feedback loop. The public was fascinated by the royals because their lives had a direct impact on the nation's stability and prosperity. This public fascination, in turn, put even more pressure on the royals to perform their biological duties. The entire society, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant, was invested in the goings-on of the royal bedchamber. It wasn't just gossip, it was a matter of life and death, war and peace, poverty and prosperity. The shame and trauma of two individuals in a cold bed could shape the destiny of millions. After the bodies have been spent, the traumas have scarred over, and the political dust has settled. The final, most insidious act begins, the rewriting of history. The bitter, humiliating, and often grotesque reality of these royal marriages is systematically scrubbed clean, polished, and repackaged for public consumption. The messy biological truth is buried under layers of romantic myth, political propaganda, and heroic narrative. This is the great con, the cynical magic trick, where the squalid reality of a state-sanctioned breeding program is transformed into a timeless tale of love and destiny. It's the process by which the filth of the past is laundered into the pristine fabric of national heritage. The primary tool for this historical revisionism is the court historian or the official biographer. These were not objective scholars, they were employees of the crown, their careers dependent on producing a narrative that flattered their patrons. Their job was to take the raw, ugly material of reality and spin it into gold. A king's desperate, sweaty fumbling in the dark becomes a tender, chivalrous respect for his young bride's modesty. A 7-year-long failure to consummate the marriage is not presented as a humiliating saga of impotence and medical quackery, but as a period of patient courtship, allowing a deep and abiding love to blossom before the duties of the flesh were addressed. It is a masterclass in euphemism. The language is carefully chosen to elevate and obscure. Lust becomes passion, political calculation becomes prudence, and brutal necessity becomes divine will. The story of Henry VIII is perhaps the most stunning example of this legacy laundering. In the popular imagination, he is not a paranoid, syphilitic tyrant who murdered, divorced, and discarded women in a desperate, neurotic quest for a male heir. He is bluff King Hal, a larger-than-life figure, a charismatic colossus of English history. His 6 wives are reduced to a catchy schoolyard rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Their individual stories of terror, humiliation, and suffering flattened into a convenient mnemonic device. The brutal reality of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, his visceral disgust, her public humiliation, is often treated as a comical anecdote, the story of a king who got catfished by a bad portrait. We chuckle at the absurdity, forgetting the real fear and shame that a young woman, alone in a foreign country, must have felt at the mercy of this all-powerful man. The legacy of Catherine the Great is another carefully curated myth. We remember her as the Great, an enlightened despot, a titan of the 18th century. Her disastrous marriage to the pathetic Peter III is framed as a necessary obstacle she had to overcome on her path to glory. Her numerous affairs are not seen as desperate acts of a woman seeking connection and power in a loveless prison, but as a sign of her voracious, liberated appetites, a sort of feminist power move anachronistically projected back onto her. We conveniently forget that her liberation was built on a foundation of ruthless political calculation, a likely coup against her own husband, and a lifetime of emotional armor she had to construct to survive. The stories people tell themselves to survive are the most powerful of all. and nations are no different. They need founding myths, heroic ancestors, and romantic origin stories. The truth that the great dynasty was founded on a night of drunken fumbling, or that the pivotal alliance was sealed through the state-sanctioned rape of a teenage girl, is simply too ugly to be the cornerstone of a national identity. So, the story is changed. The portraits are painted to make the subjects look nobler, more handsome, more serene. The chronicles are written to emphasize their piety, their wisdom, and their great love for each other. The embarrassing details, the medical problems, the sexual failures, these are quietly omitted from the official record, relegated to scandalous secret histories, or dismissed as the malicious gossip of enemies. This bitter legacy is a form of collective gaslighting. We are told to admire these figures, to see their lives as aspirational. We visit their opulent palaces and marvel at the grand beds where they supposedly slept, forgetting that these were not sanctuaries of love but sites of trauma. We are sold a sanitized, commercialized version of history, a theme park where the brutal realities have been paved over with gift shops and cafes. The most cynical part of this entire process is that it works. The myth almost always triumphs over the reality because it's a better story. It's more comforting, more inspiring, and far less complicated than the messy, uncomfortable truth. The rewritten history is not just a lie, it's a necessary lie, one that allows society to maintain its illusions about the nature of power, love, and destiny. The true legacy is not the glory, but the forgetting. So, after crawling through the filth and shame of the royal bedchamber, what have we learned? We've seen how the grand romantic myth of the royal wedding was a carefully constructed lie, a sugar coating on the bitter pill of a political transaction. We've witnessed the humiliating pre-rituals, the public inspections, and the crushing weight of expectation. We've stood in the cold, oppressive bedchambers and watched as terrified strangers were forced into a clumsy, joyless intimacy. We've seen how failure was not a private sorrow but a public catastrophe leading to ruin, ridicule, and sometimes even war. And we've seen how this entire ugly, brutal reality was systematically laundered, rewritten, and sold back to us as a heroic romance. The storytellers took the sweat, the blood, and the tears, and they spun it into a fairy tale, a national myth that conveniently forgot the human cost. The bitter legacy is this: the lie won. The sanitized version is what endures, displayed in museums and celebrated in national holidays. And here is the final bleak punchline. We haven't escaped this. We've just gotten better at hiding the strings. The public's insatiable, prurient obsession with the reproductive lives of the powerful is as strong as it ever was. We've simply swapped the courtier's whisper for the tabloid headline, the royal decree for the paparazzi's long-lens photo. Think of the relentless, microscopic scrutiny of Kate Middleton's body, the ghoulish bump watch that begins the moment a royal wedding is announced, the public countdown to the birth of an heir, the speculation about the child's name, the obsessive analysis of the first official photo. We are all courtiers now, pressing our faces against the digital glass of the royal fishbowl, demanding to see the evidence of dynastic continuity. Her body, like the body of Anne of Cleves or Marie Antoinette, becomes public property, a vessel for national hopes and anxieties. We may not have a formal inspection of the sheet, but we have something far more pervasive, a 24/7 global media apparatus that dissects every outfit, every gesture, every perceived pound gained or lost. The pressure is less direct perhaps, but infinitely more widespread. The mechanism of control has just been outsourced from the state to the culture of celebrity. It's the same grotesque pageant of fertility, just with better lighting and a more sophisticated PR team. So, as you consume the next piece of news about a royal baby or a celebrity wedding, ask yourself, what has really changed? Are we not still participating in the same ancient voyeuristic ritual? Are we not still treating human bodies as public spectacles, their most intimate moments as entertainment, their reproductive choices as a matter of public debate. The truth is, the gilded cage is still very much intact. We just call it a platform now, and we are all, to some degree, the guards, peering in, demanding our pound of flesh. Forget the fairy tale, you're living in the sequel, and it's just as messy.